The first sound is not the thunder of bolters or the roar of engines, but silence, the kind that presses against the inside of your helm until you can hear your own breath rasping through the Vox grill, shallow and unsteady, fogging the lenses as you stare across a battlefield that should be alive with prayer and purpose, yet feels abandoned by every god that ever promised salvation. Ash drifts like gray snow over broken rockcrete and twisted ceramite, and somewhere in that choking haze you realize the words you were taught as a child. The catechisms whispered by incense-heavy priests and drilled into you by commissars with iron gazes no longer form in your mind. Faith does not answer. Only the weight of your bolter remains, solid and real in your hands, warm from recent fire. The last honest thing left in a universe that has decided to test you to the breaking point. If you find yourself drawn into moments like this, where belief is stripped bare and only resolve remains, then stay with me, and if you are willing, lend this telling your approval by liking, sharing, and subscribing, not as an obligation, but as a quiet signal in the void that these stories still matter, that someone is listening as the guns begin to speak again. I was born on a manufacturum world whose skies were permanently stained the color of rust, where the sun was little more than a pale disk glimpsed through smog and prayer banners, and from my earliest memory the Emperor was less a figure and more an atmosphere, present in every clanking conveyor and every exhausted worker bent over an assembly line. We were taught that he watched from Terra, sustained by the Golden Throne, his will blazing across the galaxy through the Astronomicon to guide humanity's ships and souls alike, and we believed because belief was easier than questioning the endless shifts, the nutrient paste, the screams when a machine claimed another careless limb. Faith was survival there, a tool as necessary as a respirator or a data slate stamped with your labor quota. When the tithe came and the Astra Militarum took me, it felt less like conscription and more like destiny finally reaching out a gauntleted hand. They shaved my head, burned the aquila into my flesh, and replaced the hum of the manufactorum with the barked orders of drill sergeants and the rattle of laser guns. I learned to march, to shoot, to recite the litany of true aim even as my arms trembled with exhaustion. And through it all I held on to the idea that somewhere beyond the stars, the Emperor saw this and approved. That was the promise. Endure, obey, and you would never truly be alone. The first world we were sent to was a nameless rock on the edge of a contested system, its designation nothing more than a string of numbers on a munitorum manifest. But when the landers touched down and the ramps dropped, it became painfully real. The air stank of promethium and burned flesh, a metallic tang that coated the tongue and refused to fade, and the ground shook with distant artillery like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Trenches scarred the plains in jagged lines filled with mud, and men who had been waiting too long for relief that never came. They looked at us with hollow eyes as we took our places, as if trying to see whether we were reinforcements or simply more bodies for the earth. The enemy that day was orc, green shapes boiling out of the smoke with crude weapons and brutal laughter that carried even over the din of battle, and when they charged, the world narrowed to sights and triggers and the disciplined rhythm of volleys. Faith flowed easily then, shouted in unison as we fired, each prayer punctuated by recoil and the crack of last fire. The Emperor protects, we screamed, and for a while it felt true, because we held and the orcs fell in heaps, and the line did not break. In those moments, belief is simple, almost intoxicating because success seems to confirm everything you were ever told. But wars in the 41st millennium are never content to remain simple. The weeks dragged on, the orcs came again and again, and the sky grew darker as smoke layered upon smoke until day and night blurred into a perpetual dusk. Supplies dwindled, medici tents overflowed, and the priests' voices grew hoarse from endless sermons meant to steal our resolve. It was during one of those sermons, delivered from atop a makeshift pulpit of ammo crates, that I first felt the crack form in my faith. The priest spoke of martyrdom with shining eyes, of the glory awaiting those who died in the Emperor's name, and as I looked around at the bandaged stumps and fevered faces, I wondered why glory looked so much like neglect. That thought would have horrified the child I once was, but the battlefield has a way of forcing honesty upon you. When your friend bleeds out in the mud because the evacuation Valkyrie was shot down, when you watch a commissar execute a man for hesitating even as shells rain down, when you realize that prayers do not stop shrapnel, something shifts. It does not vanish all at once. Faith phrase thread by thread, until one day you find yourself reciting the litanies by rote, the words hollow, your finger tightening on the trigger, because that is what actually keeps you alive. We were redeployed before the Orc War reached its bloody conclusion, reassigned to a crusade fleet pushing into a sector long lost to Imperial control. The transition from muddy trenches to the cold, echoing halls of a troop transport should have been relief, but instead it felt like a pause before something worse. The ship's decks vibrated constantly, a reminder of the vast engines straining to carry us through the warp, guided by the Astronomican's distant light. At night, or what passed for night aboard a vessel that never slept, I would lie in my bunk, listening to the groans of the hull and wonder how many souls had been lost to the warp storms we threaded, and whether the Emperor truly watched each one fade. Our destination was a hive world, whose spires rose like broken teeth from a poisoned sea, its name spoken with a mixture of reverence and dread by the officers who briefed us. It had fallen to rebellion decades earlier, the details muddied by time and censorship, but the truth awaited us in the form of barricaded streets, heretical banners, and the stench of decay that clung to every level. The rebels called themselves liberators, their propaganda plastered across hab-block walls, promising freedom from imperial tithes and dogma, and as we advanced through the underhive, I saw civilians watching us from shadowed doorways, their expressions not fearful but curious, as if weighing which side might finally break the cycle of oppression. Urban warfare is intimate in a way open battlefields are not. You hear the enemy breathe, smell their fear, see their eyes widen a heartbeat before you pull the trigger. It was in a narrow alley choked with refuse and flickering lumen strips that my squad was ambushed, shots ringing out from windows above, one of our number dropping with a scream as his armor failed. We returned fire blindly at first, adrenaline surging, and then with grim precision as training took over. When it was done, the silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the wet gurgle of a dying man who could not have been more than a few years older than me. I stood there, bolter smoking, staring at the symbol painted on his chest, a crude mockery of the Imperial Aquila twisted into something new, and I felt nothing but a vast weary emptiness. He had believed in something, just as I once had, and now that belief lay shattered on the cold stone. The priest would have called him a heretic and moved on, but I could not shake the sense that we were all trapped in the same machine, grinding ourselves down in the name of ideals too distant to feel real. Faith did not surge to fill that void. Habit did, duty did. I reloaded and advanced because that was what soldiers do. As the campaign dragged on, whispers spread through the ranks, the kind that thrive in the dark corners of troop holds and ruined habs. Some spoke of seeing the Emperor in dreams, his light flickering, strained, as if the burden of the Golden Throne grew heavier with each passing century. Others muttered that the Astronomican had dimmed during warp transit, that navigators had screamed of shadows pressing closer than ever before. These were rumors, nothing more, quickly silenced by officers and priests alike. But once heard, they lingered, gnawing at the edges of certainty. If the Emperor's light could falter even for a moment, what did that mean for the rest of us? The answer, when it came, arrived not as revelation but as catastrophe. Our regiment was deployed to secure a manufacturum district believed to be producing weapons for the rebels, a labyrinth of conveyor belts, smelters, and towering machines that loomed like slumbering giants. The fighting was brutal and close, rebels and guardsmen clashing amid showers of sparks and molten slag, servitors stumbling through the chaos, their augmetic limbs continuing assigned tasks even as bodies fell around them. It was there, deep within that industrial hell, that the necrons rose from beneath the floor, ancient forms of living metal unfolding with a sound like grinding tombstones. No sermon prepares you for the first time you face something that should not exist. Last fire splashed harmlessly from their bodies, green energy weapons cutting down men with horrifying efficiency, and the air filled with screams and the ozone stink of alien technology. Orders dissolved into chaos as squads broke and ran, discipline shattering under the weight of primal terror. I remember firing until my pack ran dry, then switching to a fallen comrade's weapon, my mind blank, faith utterly absent. There was no prayer on my lips as I fought, only instinct, rage, and the desperate need to survive another second. It was the arrival of the adeptus custodes that turned the tide, golden figures striding through the smoke like living legends, their armor radiant even in the gloom, guardian spears blazing with controlled fury. They moved with a purpose and certainty that felt almost unreal, cutting through the necrons with surgical precision, and for a moment watching them, something stirred in my chest. Not faith as I once knew it, but awe, raw and unfiltered. These were the Emperor's chosen. It was said his will made manifest, and if they still fought, still stood, then perhaps not all was lost. Yet even as the necrons were driven back and the manufacturum secured at terrible cost, The feeling did not last. The custodians did not speak to us, did not offer reassurance or explanation. They withdrew as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving us amid the wreckage to count our dead and tend our wounded. Whatever purpose had brought them there was beyond our understanding, and the gap between myth and reality yawned wider than ever. Faith once cracked does not mend easily. In the aftermath, as we regrouped and licked our wounds, I found myself spending long hours cleaning my bolter. The ritual grounding in a way prayer no longer was. The weight of the weapon, the smell of oils and propellants, the familiar mechanics, all of it felt honest. Bolters do not promise salvation. They offer a simple transaction. You pull the trigger and something dies. In a galaxy where gods are distant and truths are obscured by millennia of dogma, that clarity is seductive. The final breaking point came on a world whose surface was a wasteland of glassed deserts and skeletal ruins, the aftermath of some ancient catastrophe lost to record. We were tasked with holding a line against an advancing force of chaos cultists, their chants carried on the wind, blasphemous echoes of the prayers we once shared. The sky above was a bruised purple, warp energy bleeding through thin places in reality, and even the air felt wrong, heavy with menace. The priests urged us to stand firm, to trust in the Emperor's protection, but as the first demons clawed their way into existence, screaming impossibilities, those words rang false. Men broke, some fled, some fell to their knees begging for mercy from any power that would listen. I stood, bolter raised, and for the first time I did not wait for an order. I fired because there was no other choice. Around me others did the same, a ragged line of survivors holding back the tide through sheer stubbornness. There was no glory in it, no sense of divine favor, only exhaustion and the grim satisfaction of denying the enemy ground inch by bloody inch. When the battle finally ended, the cultists routed and the warp rift sealed at tremendous cost. We were fewer than half our original number. The priests spoke again of sacrifice and victory, but their voices seemed small against the vast, uncaring sky. As I looked at the faces of those who remained, I saw not zeal, but a hardened resolve born of shared trauma. We had not been saved. We had endured. In the quiet that followed, as the dead were burned and the living prepared to move on to the next war, I thought about faith, about what it meant to believe in a galaxy that offers no guarantees. Perhaps faith was never meant to be a shield, I realized, but a lens, a way to endure the unendurable, or perhaps it was simply another tool, like a bolter, useful until it breaks or runs dry. I did not have an answer, and I no longer felt the need to force one. I still fight for the Imperium. I still bear the Aquila and follow orders, because the alternative is oblivion, and humanity has enemies enough without turning on itself. But when the guns roar and the world burns, when prayers falter and promises feel hollow, I know what will carry me through. Not blind faith in distant powers, but the men and women beside me, the weight of my weapon and the simple, brutal truth that in the far future when faith fails, only bolters remain on the battlefield.